Okay, good afternoon to you all. And you're very welcome to this talk on Beatha Cholm Cille. Firstly, I'd like to thank Paul O'Friel and Island Voices Project for inviting me to talk on this project. And indeed, I've previously spoken on the place names tradition of Derry, which has links obviously to Colm Cille and the area's rich ecclesiastical history and heritage. So I'm more than happy to have an opportunity to further my research into the tradition and to help with the various events which will be used to mark 1500 years since the birth of this vitally important figure of Irish history. Whilst I intend to give a very brief historical background to place my own work, I suppose, in some sort of a historical context, it should be noted that Professor Moira Niamhrain's talk on crossing the Sea of Moyle and Dr. Brian Lacey's talk on Colm Cille and Adamnan, the lands, the languages and literature, which were given as part of this Island Voices series over the past few months, are more than worth a listen to and deal much more with the historical significance of Colm Cille. So, what exactly am I doing here, and what is this project about? You may be looking at this photograph and wondering who these characters are. Well, the most important person in this picture, I suppose, apart from Colm Cille, is Anraí Mac Giolla Chomhaill, and he's the gentleman seated in the bottom part, and he's been presented a number of years ago with an honorary doctorate from the University of Ulster. And we have Professors Seamus McMahon and Professor Malachy O'Neill and myself in the picture. The reason we're there is because we all consider Anraí Mac Giolla Chomhaill, and we all always have considered him as being a mentor to us during different times in our lives. And this really is the reason why I am involved in this project, and actually probably one of the reasons I'm involved in a lot of areas of Irish language. Thankfully, Anraí Mac Giolla Chomhaill is still alive and well and has given his blessing to this project. So what is the project essentially? Well, the initial idea for this was initiated by Father Frank McBrathy, who's the editor of Chimera on Chríro Nifa. And he contacted me in 2019 to suggest that it may be an idea to consider a republication of this book, Beatha Cholm Cille. You see the image here. Now, this book was edited by Anraí Mac Giolla Chomhaill, we've mentioned here, and who's also known as Father Harry Coyle. And the work was completed in 1980, and it was published in 1981 by Fáilte Náisiúnta, that's National Publications. When Anraí Mac Giolla Chomhaill published Beatha Cholm Cille, which translates as the Life of Colmcille, for those of you who don't speak Irish, he chose excerpts from Manus O'Donnell's work, which I will discuss shortly, and produced a text in a form of modern Irish. Now, it's very important that we understand what I mean by a form of modern Irish, because this is the key and the reason for the current process that I'm undertaking. This was a very welcome addition to Irish literature and ecclesiastical history at the time from a most prolific writer and linguist as Harry is. And it gave the world of Irish academia a further insight into the language used in the 15th and 16th century in Ireland. And as a linguistic piece, it's absolutely vital that this work is recognised as that, because predominantly this is what the work, I'm not saying that it hasn't got any other value, but this is initially gives us a lot of insight, as I say, into the nature of the language at the time. So, having discussed the various possibilities in correspondence with Father McBrathy, who I already mentioned has initiated this project, and further discussions with Niall Scott from Colm Cille. Now, before I go on, I want to express my extreme gratitude to Niall for facilitating this project and providing some necessary funding. Colm Cille is the group within Forest na Gaeilge that promotes projects between Ireland and Scotland, and particularly, obviously the name gives it away, Colm Cille, work that has associated with that connection that Colm Cille created between Ireland and Scotland. So it was decided anyway that a modern version and slightly more accessible version of Beatha Cholm Cille would be produced in Irish and at a later stage in Gaelic na Halaban. And this is a departure from the original reasons behind Mac Giolla Chomhaill version. We are absolutely indebted to Anraí for selecting the various pieces and providing us with a modernised version. And this is important to emphasise, a modernised version of parts of Beatha Cholm Cille. And it is hoped that a digital version of the text will be made available on Untilted's website for comparative and linguistic purposes at a later stage. The issue, however, remains that there is a particular scarcity of readers of Irish who can understand the language in a classical form such as this. This may be a sad fact. This may be something that we should think about addressing down the line, but it is a fact that the number of people who can read classical Irish, no matter how modernised its spelling, or sorry, not so much the spelling, but no matter how modernised the print is, etc., it's still very, very difficult when you have words and structures and spellings and endings, etc., that are left in the classical form. It's very difficult for people to understand. So the idea is to make this work more accessible to readers of modern Irish, and indeed, as I said, laterally for Gaelic and Halban. So we decided that a further editing process should take place. And it's this process I'd like to talk about today. And I'm not going to go into massive detail about the technical issues of that, but I just want to show you what the type of work it takes to produce something like this. The text itself, Beatha Cholm Cille, in terms of its worth, because often the question is asked, why are you doing this? What is the point in this? And as Brian Lish correctly points out in his own book, which we'll talk about later, this is an insight of beliefs, practices and cultural interests of Gaelic Ireland in the early part of the 16th century, prior to the Reformation and Tudor conquest. And this is vitally important, not only from a linguistic point of view, which I suppose Father Mac Giolla Chomhaill's original book gave us a great linguistic insight. I'm not saying that it didn't also give us the cultural insight, but if we want people to be able to access this, modern readers of Irish, we need to make the book, if we want them to access this whole this Gaelic Ireland and a lot of the traditions, we need to make the book more accessible and the stories more accessible. Whilst the emphasis will be as much as possible on modern and standardised spelling, we will not be completely ignoring aspects of classical Irish, and this will be highlighted and, where necessary, perhaps footnoted or altered into a modern form that is acceptable in modern spelling. But essentially, this will celebrate the shared historical and linguistic heritage which has risen from the life and lore of Colm Cille, and this is vital. The rest of this talk, I'm going to talk a bit about the challenges that are faced by editors and I suppose historians and linguists when trying to make such a text more accessible to modern readers. So essentially, the aim of this project is to provide an up-to-date, more accessible version of Beatha Cholm Cille, of parts of Beatha Cholm Cille. When I say Beatha Cholm Cille, I'm not talking about the full text. I'm talking about the book produced by Anraí Mac Giolla Chomhaill, which is almost, if you want, the best of. And he has selected stories, and he has a particular skill in selecting stories that are very, very interesting and very relevant, and some that are quite quirky, and I use that with a great respect to the tradition. So before I speak about the editorial process, I want to give a very brief explanation. I said earlier about what Beatha Cholm Cille actually is. As contrary perhaps to popular belief and the title of it, it's not actually at all a biography, if the truth be told, and a large part of it should not be considered as factual historical source material. In his introduction to his own book, what Anraí Mac Giolla Chomhaill says is, and the translation is mine, and I apologise for any mistakes that I've made. So he says, Salanarnu Taoiseach ar Gali Hir Chonel, the Manus O'Donnell, Chursha Riva Hain, a Rhoda Olis, agus a Chanachas, Funa Ni Fatrun Colm Cille, ar Foil Sanam, a While Yuli Hila, agus Beatha Cholm Cille, Tarwa Tihirshan. So he says, before Manus O'Donnell became Taoiseach of the Dali, the O'Donnells of Donegal, he set out to gather together the knowledge and legends of his patron saint, Colm Cille, at the time, and the life of Colm Cille was a result of this work. He continues and says, Mar star no mar vahashnish, Níl sihir intifa. Agus is híhir próisiúhain a einmuid blasan isir. Tá stíl an bheoga an bhríomhar ag Manus. Is sé atá an scéal a riú go mhaith, agus tá sé do bhua ag a fásta go deag leis anam a chur sa chóra. Dar le scalarí go léiríonn sihirháis caint na naoine a ró idirthasach orthú sa rééis sin ribh an iompú creidimh. Mar sin de tá táhacht nach bug leis an teacs ó híomh star na teanganta. So as a history or a biography, the work's not reliable, and it only really gives us a taste of prose. Manus has a very lively writing style. He's able to tell a story well, and he also has the virtue of being able to put his soul into the conversation. According to scholars, Manus's work reflects the speech of those who were educated in that period before the Reformation. Therefore, the text is of considerable importance from the point of view of the history of the language, and I mentioned that earlier on. It's vitally important as well from a linguistic point of view. Ach, os fear anu a bhí an Manus túr nó leadernach, tan bheatha ceandan i leor Gaeilge is speisiúla sá leite de bhfuil. But since Manus is rarely boring, repeated that, Beatha is one of the most interesting readable Irish language books we have. Sa díalam seo Johar Rebra, túramas shrian de one leor, nátaí folklore agus inheacsana. Is sé as dóchas an tiomsachóra go gurthaí an teagran gurthaí seo a golaíon léaniu, chomas léthirí Gaeilge linne, táit na bhhainst as leor a ró rachatir ó scríbhú é tá carú le ceithre chéad bliain ó han. This anthology contains an introduction, about a third of the original book, notes, a dictionary and indexes. It's the hope of the compiler that this shortened edition in today's language will enable readers of modern Irish to enjoy a book that has been in demand since it was written over 400 years ago. Before I speak about the various challenges faced when editing such text, I must point out that I had the benefit of two sources that were not available to the original editor, to my mind. The first was and I'm just going to skip on a slide quickly here just to show you this, and then I'll be moving back. The first was the Life of Colm Cille, which was edited in English by Dr. Brian Lacey in 1988, which is an English language version of the complete text of Beatha Cholm Cille. And this text is vital, and this book is vital, as it is a translation, and it helps a lot with the translated version. If there are certain things, obviously, Brian Lacey spent a massive amount of time on this, and it is a work of huge scholarly importance. So the translation was a great aid to me, and will be a great aid when we're trying to sort of work through exactly what the original Gaelic language text means or implies, etc. So say this translation, or this version of the translation, wasn't available at the time. But another book, and this is mentioned by Lacey in his introduction, he talks about the edition by Father A.O. Kelleher in 1918, and you see that this is actually, and I've put the link up here to this, and I don't, if people want to screenshot it or download it, I'm scared to click on it in case it ruins my whole videoing process. But basically, this link here will tell you where you can go and basically get this, and you can see this is just shows you some of the manuscript. But what you have here is Beatha Cholm Cille, where basically you get on the left hand side a very early version of the script, which has been taken straight from the manuscript, and I'm going to show you an example of this later on. But it's been taken from the manuscript and then translated to English. But the translation is very, very archaic and very difficult to follow. So Brian Lacey has provided a much more modern, readable translation in English, and this will help the process. And the reason that I'm going to go back to Brian Lacey's image here of his book, etc., he mentions the following concerning his own English language edition. And he said, a few liberties have been taken silently with the prose text. O'Donnell's sentences are often very long. In most cases, these have been broken up, and the original conjunctions between clauses are either ignored or altered as the text required. In addition, a practical approach has been adopted in relation to the use of proper nouns and pronouns. These have been altered and substituted as required for the purpose of making the text clear. And I wanted to highlight this. Sorry, I'll just jump back. The purpose of making the text clear. And that has been the editorial policy, the line that I've kept in my head since we begun this. As much as possible, yes, we want to retain aspects of the original text, and this is not a rewriting of Beatha Cholm Cille, but the final product has to be readable, and that's something that I feel quite strongly about as an editor. So this line really is the key to the editorial policy for the purpose of making text clear. This does not mean, however, a complete standardization of the text, nor does it mean a basic simplification of the language. We're not attempting to dumb down the language in any way here. So what I'd like to do now is spend a wee bit of time explaining the different stages of this project and where we currently are with it and the plans for the future. So you see here my lovely picture of Iona. So essentially, the initial part of this project was the digitization of the text of Mac Giolla Chommhaill's original book. People might think with modern OCR and scanning, etc., that this should be simply a case of scan each page. But I found that there were difficulties with that in terms of, when you start going down the line of copy and pasting, etc., it becomes difficult. And I thought that actually it would help my own editorial process if the text was typed. It's not a hugely long amount of text, but the point about it is that it probably was about 15 full days work of actually typing, but it helps the editorial process because you have to reread the book and you begin to think about, oh, this is something that I'm going to have to go back on. And whilst I was doing that, I was able to take notes on areas that words that were commonly appearing that I thought there may be issues with. So this sort of gives a head start to the editorial process, and it also means that you have a digitized version of the text to share amongst people who are going to assist on the editorial team. This brought me to the next part, which was the finalization of an editorial team and an initial discussion on editorial policies. And currently, we have 3 sub-editors on board, people who are very capable and very much interested in the project. We would welcome other editors down the line. So if there's anyone listening in who feels that they have sufficient knowledge of classical Irish and wish to participate in this project, feel free to drop me a line. My email is nm.comer@ulster.ac.uk. If you Google that, you'll find that anyway. But as I say, we're more than happy to take people on board. At the minute, from November to February, so it's quite a tight time frame, is the editing of the text, and that involves several online meetings where each person is assigned a number of pages or a number of stories within the text, and they apply the editorial policy to that. Now, that's not to say that that will be changed later, because there'll be a final editing process to make sure that everything is consistent. From February to April 2021, there's a translation to Gaelic, and again, there's a question that I haven't fully answered yet with the translation to Gaelic: is, are we translating the final edited new version of Irish to Gaelic, or because of the closeness of the in fact, Gaelic and Irish Gaelic in the 15th, 16th century, in written form, in classical written form, were practically identical. So the question is, do we think about a new editorial policy, or do we just translate straight from modern Irish to modern Gaelic? That is a discussion that has yet to happen. From April 2021 to May 21, sort of final design, layout, final touches, etc. And then from June 2021 onwards, publication and launch, etc. Okay, what are the editorial challenges that we have? And these are editorial challenges that happen across the board. These aren't just challenges that we have in this particular project. Essentially, if you're presenting a book to modern readers, you have to ask yourself a number of questions. What words would people not understand? And we'll see in the example on the next page that there are words that, yes, do exist in modern Irish, but because of the genre and because of the subject matter we're dealing with, are there words appearing that are so unusual and that are so uncommon that we need to think about a way of explaining those? And in a way, a glossary of terms or footnotes, etc., can help with that a lot. And by the way, when I talk now about editorial challenges, I'm not giving answers, because this is fluid, and a lot of these issues haven't been decided upon yet. So we have to consider the words that people don't understand. Then we have to think about spellings and grammatical forms, excuse me, that people would not understand either. So, for example, if you have something that has, the Irish language has evolved considerably, very much considerably since the 15th, 16th century, but has evolved even in the past 40, 50 years, with a move towards a very standardised language and an encouragement of standard Irish. The third point, syntax, and that's a more difficult one, because you have to ask yourself, okay, the syntax and structure of a sentence, if it's something that's not modern, how much do you change it? And how do you do that in a very consistent way across the board? Number 4, in biblical phrases, there are quotes from the Bible during this, throughout Beatha Cholm Cille, but we have a modern version of the Bible and a modern translation of the Bible and a standard translation. So do we stick with the versions that were used in Beatha Cholm Cille, or do we use modern standardized versions? Things like, what words are specific to Donegal Irish? What do we do with verse? There's quite a lot of poetry and verse through this, that follows different structures and meter. Do we alter that in such a way to make it more understandable, or do we, leave it as it is, footnote it, etc.? One thing we can't do is completely standardize it, because it would lose a lot of its original richness. And how do we explain the changes we make? Do we use footnotes? Do we want a book that has, a lot of footnotes at the end where people have to keep referring to the bottom? Or do we have a glossary of terms at the end? Or do we explain everything in an initial editorial policy? So these are all the challenges that we are working on at the minute. But just to give you an example of the journey of the text to date, and really this is something that, and I'm going to conclude with this, but if you take, for example, in this first part, okay, and this is a transcription of the original manuscript, the original manuscript by Manus O'Donnell, and the bits in italic were added in by the scholars who did this in 1918. But you see here that a modern reader of Irish, incidentally, these guys that look like the number 7 is the word agus and in Irish. And you find in early manuscripts, there's a lot of what we would consider now to be short form. So this is the version that was taken straight from the manuscript. There are very few modern Irish speakers or modern readers of Irish who could understand this. Okay. Likewise, if you look at the translation that was done at the time, here beginneth the life of the holy abbot and patriarch and chief prophet of heaven and earth, even Colm Cille, which is a mistranslation by O'Kelleher of the word Éan here, son of Philemid, albeit the clergy of Erin, clergy of Erin, etc., etc. The English is even very, very difficult to understand, and very unclear. Then we have the version by Anraí Mac Giolla Chomhaill, which is in a modern Irish version of text with a few editorial changes. And he says, Chanschnitzer Baha an Abba Nifa agus Usalahar agus Priawai Nieva agus Talun and Shaw Eon Colm Cille Vic Elemi. An She do Ligde son De gan Chema Abarja na Abdanya Manach Nu do Ve Ege san English. Agus Clear Erin agus Alban agus Eher Dawn Ga Heu Mar Uchtran or Huhen. Now, again, I'm very much aware that there are people who listening in who possibly don't speak Irish. That is quite close to that, but it has been modernized in terms of spelling. So you say Inti, he calls it Unche, the person, but he doesn't really change structures, or he doesn't really change. Dobe and Dove Ege are practically the same, and these are features that don't really appear in modern Irish, the Dolig and Dove, and this is a very simple example of what I need to do in the long run. Then if we take Lacey's English translation, The life of the holy abbot and patriarch and chief prophet of heaven and earth, that is, Colm Cille begins here. Although the clergy of Ireland, Scotland, and the Western world chose him to be preeminent over them, for God's sake, he declined any position in the church higher than the abbacy of the Black Monks. There is no issue whatsoever that this is probably the most understandable of all of them and the clearest. And that is what my suggestion, for example, and you may think that this is just a sample. You'll see that I have changed McGill Coles and I've taken out things that I consider to be tricky for modern readers. So you see, for example, I've taken out, I've standardised the spelling of this here, of aon, or no, aon, but I've moved the dolig, so on che alig de, or son je. I've taken out this manach, it's manach du, Black Monks here. Older form here is manach nu. Again, it's a form of grammar that's now obsolete. And again, made it where I think that a modern reader of Irish would have no great difficulty understanding this, and it's not taking away hugely from this, which ultimately is quite a good reflection of this, of the original Irish. So basically, the idea is that we make this readable as possible, but we still do not completely change the original classical Irish version. Obviously, there's much more than I have time to go into involved in this, and I'm more than happy to discuss this with people I know, because this is a recorded forum that's not a great opportunity to answer questions. But anyone who wants to contact me about this, or indeed who wants to take part in the project, please do let me know. So I hope everyone keeps safe, and I'd just like to mar acal sgur no mar acal buhéise an Jerry. Want to thank Paul O'Friel and Aaron Hamilton, Muil Colm Scott, Dr. Brian Lacey, and particularly Anraí Mac Giolla Chomhaill, my very, very old friend and mentor, without whom I would not be anywhere near this and would not be participating in the Irish language at the level that I've been allowed to over the past number of years. So, Fanagé Sábailte agus Bíú Nolig, why I gach daine agah. Gur maigah.